Good morning. Bienvenue à la conférence de presse avec Senator Kim Pate. Welcome to the press conference with Senator Pate. Go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you very much. My name is Kim Pate. I'm very pleased to be joined this morning by Alex Neve and by Scott Heatherington. Alex Neve is a professor of law at the University of Ottawa and also former Secretary General of Amnesty International. Scott Heatherington is a former ambassador and former intelligence lead with the Government of Canada, now retired. We regret that Hadiat Nazimi, human rights lawyer who was supposed to join us, is unable to do so because of family health emergency, but we're very pleased to be here. We have just returned from Syria, and where we had the opportunity to meet with a number of Canadians, women, children, and 2 of the 9 men we requested to meet with while we were there. We are extremely concerned by what we saw, what we experienced, and what we heard on the ground while we were there. Nothing in my working life prepared me for the experience I would have over the last week. Canada prides itself on being a human rights leader and has prided itself on being an international human rights leader. What we saw is Canada not being at the forefront of both fulfilling its obligations or participating with the international community to ensure that human rights are upheld in the region of northeast Syria, where the Canadians we met with are detained. But the good news is it's not too late, and change can happen as early as this afternoon, as we will speak about. Canada thus far has had no consular visits with any of the prisoners. Some consular visits via video, we understand, with some of the women. And that must change immediately. There are significant health concerns of individuals who are there. The people of northeast Syria, the autonomous administration of north and east of Syria, were very informative, very open, very welcoming to our delegation, but we were not an official Canadian delegation. We were a human rights, civil society, humanitarian delegation. We had moving opportunities to meet directly with family members who have lost loved ones. We met with folks who are working in the judicial system, the chief judge, judges who now number in only 30 trying to deal with between 4,000 and 5,000 cases involving serious criminal and terrorism accusations. They're operating in a school because the courthouse was bombed. We also were able to visit, as we mentioned, in the prisons, and we saw human rights violations in large part because of the absolute incapacity of ANIS to keep up with the needs of the 4,000 to 5,000 prisoners who are currently being detained. We were impressed with despite that, with the encouragement and the commitment of the ANIS administration to justice and peace. Repeatedly, they talked about the need for international assistance to ensure that those who have been accused can be held to account, but also so that they can continue to combat ISIS. And as we saw, in fact, there were attacks while we were in the region. The violence conducted by the Turkish military and suspected ISIS cells continues, and the administration is left to languish on its own without the necessary international protection, aside from some protection, some infrastructure in the form of military intervention. We also, when we met with prisoners, we were shocked to see that individuals, although they had been interrogated sometimes dozens, 3, 4 times that by international authorities, they believe by the FBI. They were not aware, if there have been any Canadians there interrogating them, they were not identified as Canadians to them. Suffice to say, all of this must change immediately, and we will continue to work on the ground and with our colleagues in the government to actually try to change this. I'll now turn over to my colleagues, to Mr. Neve and then to Mr. Heatherington, to detail a little more about some of what we are calling upon the government to do.
Thank you very much, and good morning. As Senator Pate has indicated, before traveling to northeast Syria, our delegation was aware of at least 9 Canadian men who are reportedly held in prisons in the region, who have been detained for many years without charge or trial, without contact or communication with their families, without access to lawyers, and who are not receiving consular visits. A top priority, therefore, during our visit was to be granted access to these men. In many cases, there has not even been clear confirmation through what is often termed proof of life that they are even still alive for several years. In the end, we were able to visit with 2 of the men held in different prisons on the last day of our visit. And we received considerable assistance from officials with the autonomous administration in making those arrangements, which we deeply appreciate. We were and remain very disappointed and concerned that we did not obtain access to the other men. We met with Mohammed Ali and Jack Letts. For both men, our visit came as an unexpected surprise, and I think we can say a source of some degree of relief and hope. Both men were eager, above all, to hear news of their families. And while we were able to share that with Jack Letts, including some messages from his parents and his brother, we unfortunately did not have anything we could offer to Mohammed Ali by way of news of his family. Both men also shared with us that they face serious health concerns. Mohammed Ali did not, however, feel able to share further details, given that our interview, by necessity, was conducted with prison officials present. They have both been held for over 5 years. They have not been charged in northeast Syria or brought before a judge or tribunal, nor have there been any steps taken towards repatriating, extraditing, or deporting them to face charges and a trial in another country. Neither man, to their knowledge, has received a visit from a Canadian delegation or representative in that time. As Senator Pate indicates, they've been questioned repeatedly by security officials from other countries, most frequently by the FBI. Mohammed Ali indicated he believes he's been questioned 25 times by the FBI, but none of that has led to any legal proceedings being taken against them either. Instead, they languish, warehoused with thousands of other foreign nationals in detention centers across the region, held beyond the reach of law, far from outside scrutiny, in a detention regime that is devoid of any sense of accountability, and in which human rights violations are unsurprisingly rampant. It has echoes of the widespread abuses we witnessed following September the 11th. We found ourselves thinking of Guantanamo Bay, of black hole detention sites, of such Canadian cases as Meher Arar, Omar Khadr, Abdullah al-Malki, Ahmed al-Mati, and Muyad Nuruddin, and wondering how we could possibly be back in that same space again. Importantly, both men made it clear that they are more than prepared to face justice if they are safe and the investigation and proceedings are fair. Jack Letts was emphatic that nothing that he has said in the past and nothing that has been said about him in previous media coverage reflects his true story. Is this justice? Clearly not. Is it an approach that is laying the ground for establishing meaningful and durable security in northeast Syria? Clearly not. If anything, it adds only to the layers of insecurity and instability in a region that continues to face tremendous threats and risks of violence, be that through Turkish drone attacks or ongoing attacks from ISIS cells in the region. Both of those were apparent just before or during our visit. As Senator Pate has indicated, we had extensive meetings with ANIS officials and spoke at length about justice, accountability, and human rights. From judges and from administration officials, we heard a strong endorsement of the importance of bringing all detainees to trial promptly in fair proceedings, and notably, with a firm rejection of the death penalty. At the same time, they have been virtually abandoned by the international community, including Canada, when it comes to the resources, capacity, and institution building to make that viable. They have urged foreign governments to repatriate their own nationals and pursue justice back in their home countries. Very few have. Canada has, of course, refused to repatriate any of the Canadian men and is aggressively fighting against that crucial remedy in court. They have urged the international community to establish an international criminal tribunal to pursue cases against those perhaps suspected of the most serious crimes. That too has been rebuffed. And so now they have said they have no other choice than to begin to bring criminal proceedings themselves. But the caseload is immense. 4,000 to 5,000 foreign nationals and only around 30 judges in the region's people defense courts, which hear terrorism cases. It's a mammoth task, particularly given the disinterest shown by the international community in providing the assistance and support needed. There should have been a concerted effort years ago to craft a rights-based, comprehensive justice and accountability agenda for northeastern Syria. Instead, we find ourselves in the current situation. While states such as the US and the UK are clearly the major actors behind this scenario, this disgraceful approach to dealing with detainees held since the defeat of ISIS, Canada is doing nothing to ensure that rights and justice are at the heart of strengthening security in the region, refusing to do our part by even simply taking steps to repatriate Mohammed Ali, Jack Letts, and the other 7 or potentially more Canadian men who are unlawfully detained here, leaving women and children still languishing in the camp. Alors aujourd'hui, nous demandons au gouvernement canadien d'agir immédiatement sur 2 fronts. Demander le rapatriement de tous les hommes canadiens détenus dans les centres de détention du nord-est de la Syrie et engager des poursuites équitables au Canada s'il existe des preuves que l'un d'entre eux a commis des actes liés au terrorisme ou d'autres actes criminels. Et deuxièmement, travailler avec la communauté internationale et l'ANES pour développer et fournir les ressources nécessaires pour soutenir une approche compréhensive visant à garantir la justice et la responsabilité de tous les détenus syriens et étrangers détenus dans le nord-est de la Syrie, qui soient conformes aux obligations internationales en matière de droits humains. So today we are unequivocal in calling for the Canadian government to act immediately on 2 justice fronts. Seek the repatriation of all Canadian men held in detention centres in northeast Syria, with a commitment to pursue fair proceedings in Canada if there is evidence any of them have committed terrorism-related or other criminal acts. And secondly, work with the international community and ANES to develop and provide the necessary resources to support a comprehensive approach to ensuring justice and accountability for all Syrian and foreign detainees held in northeast Syria that is consistent with international human rights obligations. And I'll turn things to my colleague, Mr. Heatherington.
Thank you very much. During my lengthy career in the Foreign Service, I've had the honor to work on consular issues, and I certainly really respect the work that consular officers do all around the world, have in the past and will do so in the future. But that is why it's so disappointing that so many Canadians in northeast Syria, including such a substantial number of children, have not had the consular support they require and is their right for so many years. Of course, the situation in northeast Syria is unique, and many Canadians may be tempted to conclude that these individuals are the authors of their own misfortune. But what was clear to us is there is no common storyline as to how or why these individuals ended up in northeast Syria at the time that the region was in the cruel grip of ISIS control. And many are now trapped in troubling and very compelling circumstances. We established that it is still possible to send officers into the region with the proper planning and mitigation measures. We also can hardly ask those who suffered or lost relatives at the hands of Daesh to guard the perpetrators of those crimes and respect their human rights while ignoring our own responsibilities to our own citizens. La chose la plus importante à savoir, c'est que ces gens ont besoin d'une aide consulaire. De toute urgence, pardon. Notre visite montre clairement qu'il est possible d'accéder aux infrastructures sur place et de se faire entendre, y compris dans les prisons. Nous nous attendons à ce que des représentants du consulat canadien emboîtent le pas sans plus attendre. At the same time, we also call on the Canadian government to issue temporary residence permits, which could be issued even this afternoon, to those non-Canadian mothers who do not wish to be separated from their Canadian citizen children and wish to be repatriated with their children so that they are not isolated and separated and left in the region while their children are denied the care and concerns of their mothers. So I think it's clear to us that much needs to be done and much can be done. Thank you.
Thank you. And just on that note, Canada knows very well the long-term genocidal impact of separating mothers and children. We only need to look at the legacy of our residential schools and the legacy for, in particular, Indigenous people. We were all struck by some of the parallels when we met with people in the Anis region, the Kurdish people. And immediately after we left the camps and the prisons, we notified consular authorities, and we have already tried to engage with the government prior to even coming here this morning. So the need for action is now. We appreciate very much the attention that many of you have paid to this and have helped pave the way for the type of work that we were able to start, and I stress start, on the ground in Syria. Thank you very much, and we'd be happy to take questions.
We'll now start the question period, one question and one follow-up. Nous allons maintenant commencer la période de questions, une question et une question de suivi. Commençons avec Jim de Canadian Press.
Good morning. There's a lot of information in your release, which is really helpful. It sounds like you met with quite a few Canadians, as you've indicated. Just to help us get a fix on the numbers, you met with 2 of the Canadian men. You indicated that there are as many as 9 there, and many of the non-Canadian mothers, and one Canadian mother with Canadian children. Can you give us a sense of the global numbers? Are there even more there, that Canadians there, that we, need help as well?
If only we could answer that question. We, in advance of our delegation, reached out to as many interlocutors as we could to assemble the most complete list we felt able to do. And that is the list of 9 Canadian men in the prisons, 1 Canadian woman and her 6 children who remain at the Raj camp, and then the 3 non-Canadian women, and amongst them 7 Canadian children. But we don't know if that's complete. And I think one of the things that was clear to us as we were on the ground, and we could see the immense challenges on the logistical front, prison management front, information flow, it became very difficult even to pinpoint where the men who we sought to interview were being held. And so that leaves you with a very worrying feeling that there could absolutely be more that perhaps the Canadian government isn't even aware of. And given the context, there's no certain way of answering that question.
You met with Jack Letts and Muhammad Ali. I don't know if Mr. Ali is one of the 4 that is in the court case or not, but anyway, that maybe you could clarify that if possible. I don't know if that's public. And tell us a little bit about your encounters with them and how were they? What was your impression of their well-being, their state of mind?
I am going to pass on the court case question simply because I don't know whether or not it can or should be disclosed whether he is or is not part of the court case. Sorry, what was the other part of your question? Oh, just in general about his... we were deeply concerned. He was clearly suffering from the experience he's been through. We asked in general. Oh, sorry.
I guess both.
Okay, I'm talking about Muhammad Ali.
Oh, I see.
We asked him in general how his health is, and he said he certainly made it clear that his health is very poor. And we asked if he felt able to provide further details about that. And he indicated, giving a nod to the fact that prison officials were present, that he wasn't. So that obviously leaves us with a sense of concern, and we have prioritized his case and that description in our follow-up with the Canadian government and urged that there should be an all-out effort to arrange for a consular visit so that can be followed up on. The meeting with Jack Letts was more open. He also indicated that he was suffering from health problems. He did feel able to share more details. I'm not going to share what they are because that's personal, but the details he provided weren't necessarily directly related to treatment in prison. But they certainly are issues that need fairly urgent follow-up. And again, we have flagged that for consular officials to make sure that they get in as quickly as possible. As Scott Heatherington has indicated, our visit does make it clear that access is possible, that there is and can be cooperation with local officials, and so we certainly hope that following up on that, the Canadian government will pull out all the stops to get consular officers in immediately.
Perfect. Next question.
I'd like to know, in terms of perhaps Mr. Heatherington, you can take this question. The fact that Muhammad Ali said he estimates that he's been interviewed at least 25 times by FBI officials, but both Mr. Letts and Mr. Ali have said they have not been interviewed by any Canadian officials, any security officials, yet security of Canadians keeps on being used as a reason for not repatriating these men. What does that show about Canadian due diligence? Have we done that? And what are officials and our government leaders using as a basis for their argument if they have not done any interviews themselves?
Well, frankly, I was somewhat puzzled by what I was told. I don't have any particular background information. I'm retired. But I would have expected that in the length of time that this man has been incarcerated, that he would have had a consular visit. And if there were concerns, and I believe there are charges pending in Canada, that somebody would have interviewed him. But first and foremost, I think he needs consular access. Normally, a consular officer also asks the person, do you have a lawyer? What are your concerns with respect to, do you want to return to Canada? And so all I can say is I don't have answers to that question, but it's on my mind as well, given the frequency and the interest of other agencies as he relayed it to us. And you know, in that instance, it raises questions, you know, what is the nature of the threat this man poses? What are the charges, you know, pending, and what's the sort of information that agencies have with respect to this individual? At the same time, you know, until you're before the courts, you're presumed innocent, and you have the right to defense and counsel. So it's this situation of people being warehoused outside of the country that I think concerns us. And we have to balance the fact that we're not unmindful of what Daesh has done and people who supported them. And we're not unmindful that, you know, we have a legitimate interest in protecting Canadians. So that's just leave me puzzled.
What Mr. Heatherington said, in this country, if someone is charged, there are procedures, as you've indicated, that are required to be followed. People have a right to counsel, they have a right to due process. It's not impossible. We were told by government officials prior to going to Syria that the RCMP had been in Syria or has been in Syria. It's possible that these men have been interviewed by Canadian officials, but they don't know that. That is in itself a huge legal issue. And if we want to hold people to account, presumably we would be following the rules wherever we are and ensuring that evidence is being gathered in a way that could hold up in courts here. If, in fact, they have been interviewed by Canadian authorities and they have not been revealed to be Canadian authorities, my question is why? For what purpose? In whose interest is that? It certainly isn't in the interest of Canadians if the Canadian government is saying the only reason they are stalling, slow, not acting on these cases is because of security risk threats to Canadians. Clearly, it flies in the face of all of that information.
I just wanted to add one other piece as well. I think it's important to note that that Jack Letts also has been repeatedly interviewed by the FBI. So it's not just Mohammed Ali, and that starts to suggest, I mean, we can't draw significant conclusions from what two people told us, but it starts to point to a potential pattern here. And one wonders if we had been able to interview the other 7, it doesn't seem unreasonable to imagine we would have heard something similar coming from almost everyone. And that's what starts to paint the picture of what's going on here. This is the warehousing notion. This is what takes us back to the era of Guantanamo Bay, that there clearly is a U.S.-led and not only carried out by U.S. forces intelligence operation underway here that seems perfectly willing to countenance parking the human rights of thousands of individuals for years on end. There's not even remotely any end in sight to any of this. Is there 25 more times that Mohammed Ali is going to be interrogated? What draws this to a close? When does somebody say the rule of law matters and rights and justice now have to be back in play?
Senator Pate, you mentioned that you were caught off guard. It was nothing could have prepared you for what you saw. Can you give a little more details about that? What was it about those camps or the conditions of the individuals you spoke with that left you with such a feeling?
It was the conditions, but it was also the fact that the very people who are guarding individuals are often family members of those who have been killed. And the fact that if that were in this country, we would not permit that to happen for fear of bias, for fear of revenge, that sort of thing. What shocked me was even in that context, I could only describe it at the time as the grace of individuals to still be insisting on rights, insisting on due process, and meanwhile having no capacity to deliver that. I was not prepared for that. I was prepared for the human rights abuses because they'd already been well chronicled by many people, Human Rights Watch, the Special Rapporteur, but I wasn't prepared for the fact that the very people responsible for the detention were also calling for the same things that we were calling for the international community to step up, to we know that they've been calling for repatriation, but they've also been calling for assistance to ensure that people are fed, that people have their human rights protected, that people are safe, that the outbreak that when we were there we were told was now 75% of the prison population has TB can be dealt with. They don't have sufficient medication, they don't have sufficient doctors, they don't have the infrastructure to feed, house, and certainly not educate when it comes to the children, all of the folks that they are now responsible for housing, and yet they're trying to desperately do that, recognizing that the primary attention coming from the international community is on those human rights violations, not on who bears responsibility. It is not solely the responsibility of the Syrian authorities to do that. They are detaining people on behalf of the international community, and it's the international community, including Canada, that in my humble opinion needs to step up.
If I could, we seem to keep wanting to bounce around and add to each other's comments, but I think picking up on this theme of what struck me, and I've been in many war zones and conflict situations and refugee camps and prisons in virtually every corner of the world. And while I went very aware of the fact that children are a big part of this story, I think when we were carrying out the interview with the Canadian woman whose 6 children were with her, it really came home to me how outrageous it is that we are dealing. I mean, we talk about a camp, but we are talking about the mass arbitrary detention of thousands of children in that camp. Children who are growing up, have been growing up for years now in those circumstances. Again, huge numbers of them, including right now, 13, we believe, Canadian citizen children, with no hope to hang their dreams on, that this is going to come to an end. That amongst all of this, governments, including our own government, are so callously prepared to disregard the best interests and fundamental rights of children is stunning.
Thank you. Next question, Radio-Canada.
Good morning. You were talking about the conditions. I wanted to know, were you able to gather photo, video evidence, and can you just give some examples of some of the things that you saw while you were there?
We were not able to. In the prisons themselves, very specifically, we were told that we couldn't take any photos or video, including during the interviews we did with the 2 men. So we don't have anything to bring back. We also did not do tours of the prisons. And that was because we had made it clear that the purpose of our mission wasn't a broader research mission into prison conditions and issues that are happening within the detention centers. Others have done some of that, including very recently the UN Special Rapporteur on counterterrorism and human rights. So we were very focused on getting updates as to, number one, on getting access and proof of life with respect to Canadians who were held there, and some updates as to how they're doing. Similarly, in the camp, while we have no reason to believe we wouldn't have been allowed or able to spend time walking around, we simply ran out of time. We actually spent a lot longer interviewing the women than it had been anticipated, and that clearly to us was the top priority. So we haven't done our own independent walk around. That said, we certainly heard from the women concerns, a whole range of concerns about difficulties in getting access to medical care, serious concerns about education and schooling for their children, issues around adequate food and water supplies. I think all talked about the excruciating conditions, given that they're intense and it's 40 to 45 degrees outside, and how absolutely horrific that is. Anything else that?
My follow-up is, why do you believe that Canada should take on the cost and the risk of removing these men when some will say that they voluntarily went to Syria?
Number one, I think we have to stay away from this idea that there's one narrative about why any of those men, and similarly any of the women, ended up in Syria. I think it's easy to paint them as the worst possible and imagine this was a deliberate, voluntary journey to go join Daesh and commit terrible atrocities. I think we need to realize so if we've got 9 Canadian men, there's 9 different stories as to what led them there. Some of which may, yes, be the basis for criminal charges, others absolutely not. So I think that's the first thing to recognize. Secondly, when it comes to issues around the cost of doing so, yes, justice and human rights costs money. And we're not disinterested parties to what has happened and what continues to happen there, including because Canadian citizens are involved, but also because the Canadian government, in direct and indirect roles, Canadian security forces, have played a role in the effort to defeat ISIS. We didn't stand back and just leave it in the hands of others. We're part of that incredibly important effort. It's a global effort such that a well-established global coalition against Daesh has been established. Canada is an active participant in that. There's every reason that Canada needs to therefore live up to our responsibilities and our ability to ensure that that certainly the 9 men we're concerned about, but more widely, that the response that is so urgently needed now to the insecurity, but also right now the impunity issues associated with those horrific years of ISIS control are dealt with in a way that respects and upholds human rights.
Thank you. We have a couple more minutes. Is there any other questions? Jim, go ahead.
You mentioned the woman with 6 children who is expressed a desire to return to Canada. We've heard a bit about her and her story, and it seems all of the women with children have been given this terrible choice of either sending their children home alone or remaining in the camps. Could you tell us a bit more about that, particularly in her context? And we understand she was in a fire. There was a tent fire, and she was burned. Did you get any insight into her well-being and state of mind about all of this?
Her clear priority was her children. We didn't go into details about the harm that was done, but it's clear that her children are assisting her. Her eldest daughters were there assisting her while we were there. And they're also, all of the mothers are concerned as well about their sons, as sons, young men are starting to disappear as they become pubescent. And so there's the concern, the immediate concern of them staying with their children, but also the longer term concern of what's going to happen to their children if in fact repatriation doesn't happen. And as I mentioned, we know well in Canada the impact of separating children from their mothers, separating children from their families, and separating children and families from their communities. And so really vitally important that Canada steps up at this stage. All of them have requested to be have temporary residence if they're not Canadian, the mothers, and the Canadian mother and her children want to immediately return.
And maybe just one further point around her health situation. I mean, we're going to protect privacy and not disclose full details, but I think what we can say is that she did make it clear to us that she continues to suffer from so much pain and restriction on her mobility and the example she gave us is she's physically unable to lift her youngest child and has to rely on her oldest daughter to be the one to do so. So that may seem like a small example to some people, but I think a lot of people that would resonate as something that must be a source of not only the physical pain she's describing, but anguish as a mother that she can't do that.
The notion that trials might eventually happen, and despite the hurdles in Syria, what do you think the implications of that are if some of these Canadians do face trials in that system eventually?
Despite the best intentions of ANIS officials, and we heard some very convincing, resolute, and courageous things from a judge we met with, from another justice official. This task it would be an understatement to say it's mammoth. Around 30 judges in that court, 4,000 to 5,000 foreign nationals who they envision putting through trials. Just start to try to do the calculus as to how long that would take in a Canadian context. And they're committed to fair trial standards. They're committed to ensuring that those who wish to be represented by defense counsel of their own choice can do so. So it's almost impossible to imagine that this is remotely viable in a way that doesn't begin to stretch out for decades. And thus all sorts of fair trial and human rights concerns that will begin to emerge immediately along the way. The responsible thing, therefore, for governments like Canada to do is to at least try to ease the load and ease the burden by living up to our part of the responsibility to repatriate the Canadians who are there. It's not a huge contribution, 9 Canadians in 4,000 to 5,000, but perhaps if we did so, that would serve as an example for other states to do similarly. Doing so with a commitment to ensure that if there is evidence that bears it out, we will follow up on justice and accountability, and that perhaps begins to make the caseload left in Syria more manageable.
And the authorities reinforced that the very delays that are happening now because of the capacity issues also hinder the ability. They're well aware, certainly the judge was well aware that that hinders the ability to hold people to account ultimately. The longer it takes to get to justice, the more elusive justice is.
Senator Pate, before your delegation left for Syria, you did meet with security officials and they did warn you about the dangers. Was it dangerous? What was the process getting to northeast Syria? Did you feel safe and secure at the time?
Well, and certainly once I had a broken shoulder, the challenges became a little more so. And certainly there are security risks. We mentioned there were attacks while we were on the ground in Syria, in areas that we had been previously, and but we were able to plan and mitigate those risks by working with security folks and working with folks on the ground and working with ANIS ahead of time. So was I aware of the risks constantly? Absolutely. Was I confident that those risks had been mitigated? Also, absolutely. There were check-ins every hour to ensure that we knew what was happening, that if we needed to move, if we needed to pull out, and at any moment, if the risk had become to the point where the officials advising us had indicated it was no longer safe for us to be in the region, we would have left. We did not have to do that. We left according to our own schedule and, in fact, at times flexed our schedule in order to accommodate some of the meetings.
And finally, you said you also met, or you also actually spoke or emailed, were in contact with Canadian officials even before this news conference. What did you ask for, and are you more hopeful that there will be action given the fact that you returned from Syria and you have this update and you were able to get new information in a secure and safe setting?
Well, the initial was immediately, my impulse immediately, and all of our impulse immediately leaving some of the institutions, was to reach out to ensure consular officials knew, Canadian consular officials knew Canadians wanted to see them. Because one of the suggestions, if I can put it that way, that had been made is that there had been no requests. We found that a little questionable, let's say. But so we had the clear evidence, so we called right away, and that got bounced around. This morning, I had a meeting with surgeons, so I was not at the meetings, but there were meetings this morning with officials, and we reached out immediately from Syria to offer to meet with the minister prior to this press conference in order to see if there was something we could do to facilitate further action. We have indicated we will continue to work with the government. We're happy to collaborate with them. We're happy to continue to collaborate with ANIS. I think we developed a good a way of working together, respectful, and we're able to gain access that the Canadian government told us was probably not possible, and clearly we showed that's not true.
And I could just, Mr. Heatherington and I met with a number of senior government officials this morning before the press conference, and gave a pretty comprehensive overview of what our program was, what we learned, our concerns. I would say they were very attentive. There was a lot of note-taking, and I saw at a number of junctures very real kind of expressions of concern around some of the things we were sharing. We put in front of them, and this wasn't necessarily new, but now it's with a sense of urgency because it comes from the ground. So we obviously made a very strong call that urgent consular attention needs to be prioritized, that Canada really needs to up its game with respect to consular services, including arranging visits in a very short time delay. We reiterated that all Canadians, women, children, and men, must be repatriated, again, very quickly, and that if evidence bears it out, justice be pursued here. Third, we called for the temporary residence permits for the non-Canadian mothers to similarly be issued. As Mr. Heatherington said in his remarks, that could be done this afternoon. That's in the purview of the minister himself. And on this notion of pursuing policies that in any way countenance the forced separation of children from their parents, from their mothers, has to be completely abandoned. And then fourth, we said it's time for Canada to start to take a completely different approach to what's happening in northeast Syria and be part of, even in a leadership role perhaps, crafting, delivering, and resourcing a rights-based and comprehensive justice and accountability agenda in northeast Syria, not the wrong-headed warehousing that has dominated for years, and to stop sitting in the background and just allowing this to play out, including to the detriment of the rights of Canadian citizens.
Thank you. Rosiana?
You mentioned Canada could be a leader here. I was curious if you have an idea as to what other people from Western countries are also there. Are we seeing other countries take action or having a similar stance of Canada of not moving on this?
I don't think there's much to be proud of anywhere in the international community. I think there are some countries that have engaged in repatriation to a greater extent than Canada has. There are others that aren't even entering into the discussion. We certainly heard that from ANIS officials, that they didn't specify which countries, but there are countries that just don't bother to engage with them at all. They never hear from them, even though they have their own nationals who are there. I think we don't have a specific recipe as to what Canada's leadership looks like. It's been such a vacuum of leadership and rights-based action on the justice and accountability front for so many years now, that there's no lack of ways in which a country like Canada, which both positions itself and quite legitimately has been an international justice champion on the world stage for many years. So we've got a lot of credibility. We've got enormous expertise, both within government, but within the legal community and civil society in Canada when it comes to fashioning, well-tailored justice responses in difficult situations like this. Canadians have often played a role around training and capacity building, have thought through creative ways to build institutions that can develop justice on a durable, sustainable basis. But we've shown no interest in doing so, and instead, to date, have just sat back and asserted that we're powerless here. Well, let's stop. We have to stop pretending we're powerless and start to be part of shaping a completely different approach.
Why do you think there is this reluctance from the Canadian government to take action here? And if that reluctance continues, what will be your next steps now that you've returned?
So there are legal proceedings underway. I think everyone's aware of that. And we're all hopeful that the Supreme Court will agree to hear an appeal of the case that's been underway for a number of months now, and that will lead to some options if our pleas and the advocacy and campaigning continue to be ignored and rebuffed. I would be shocked and dismayed if that continues to be the Canadian government's response now that there is sort of a direct message coming back from the front line. To simply continue with lines around, well, it's too dangerous to go there, or it's too difficult to engage with local officials, or we're not really clear what the Canadians who are held there want anyway. None of that holds water anymore. And I think it would be beyond unacceptable for Canada, therefore, in any way to maintain any of that. So we hope that it isn't going to take a court ruling to force Canada to do the right thing here, and that, you know, from both perspectives, that this is absolutely the right thing to do from a human rights and justice perspective. But I think I can speak for all four of us on the delegation. It was so apparent to us that it's the right thing to do from a security perspective as well. What is being pursued right now is not contributing to anyone's safety, and it feels like it's just a volatile situation that is simmering and could explode at any time on the ground in northeast Syria, and we'd be in the midst of a full-out crisis.
Thank you. This is all the time we have today. This ends the press conference. Thank you very much.